Hello, Houston. The miracle in my life is that we get these things done each day. My day started at 6 this morning. I was in the office by 7 trying to pull together the last of the stuff we were going to talk about today. And about 20 minutes before I left my office, I discovered that I had not put in all the visuals in the order that we were supposed to have them. So I will apologize in advance for the fact that some of what you see on screen today may not directly relate to what I'm talking about. We'll cover it all, and it will get integrated, but I may have to shuffle back and forth a little bit when the images are on the screen. So let's go to the screen and see what we're doing here now. And that is, you will remember that we encourage you to image a cigarette when it had been smoked 25% of the way with, say, a quarter inch of ash hanging off of it. And that's roughly the image that we came up with there, given my very limited self-acknowledged artistic ability. And the question then that we're looking at, and where the stuff will get jumbled a little bit, has to do with whether memory can be based on visual images. That is, the fight that is going on is essentially, is memory stored as images, and or is it stored as words? And there have been a number of different rather interesting pieces of research that have been done on this. For instance, Richmond and researchers that worked with him tried to demonstrate correlations between mental distance and reaction time. And the basic problem that we have here is the fact that with a word like apple, it can be stored either as the word or as the image. And therein lies the debate. And so what we've got is essentially the abstract words, like truth, which, as we were discussing the other day, really don't relate to anything that has an immediate image to it, can only be stored as a word. But the contrast to that is that we can store a word like apple, which is a very imagery-rich word, either as a word or we can store it as the image. And therein is the battle that we're going to be having, essentially. What we're going to, I hope, go into, the bottom line here is that the imagery, or I should say the concrete words, there are two things we're looking at here, imagery versus abstract words. We're also looking at concrete versus abstract. And in general, the concrete words have the double advantage of the fact that they can be stored as word, as truth can, but they can also be stored in terms of the image. And so when you look at which are the easier words to learn in a serial list, for that matter, in any list, you find that the tip always goes to the concrete words for reasons that will evolve during the course of the lecture today. And so what I'm looking for, there's the research that I was after. Richmond and his associates actually looked at a very interesting way of trying to separate out images and whether we in fact read off the images. What this is kind of based on is that railroad track example that I gave you the other day, where we had a map going from San Francisco to Reno, and then how long does it take to recall how far such a city is. And it turns out the further away it is, the longer the reaction time is before a person will estimate the miles. Well, there are a number of confounds in that. Among other things, perhaps some of you may not be very good at reading a railroad schedule or a map and translating from a line with dots on it to actual physical distances that you travel. So Richmond and his associates have been involved in research that is like what's on the screen here now. And that is essentially what these investigators and people like them have asked you to do, is to imagine, just image in your head what the hands of the clock look like when it's 3:20 in the afternoon. And that's a rough approximation of what the clock will look like at that time. Maybe the hour hand should be a little bit lower, but that's roughly what it would look like. Contrast that with imagining what the clock would look like at 7:25 in the evening. And then, in essence, what you are asked to do in that kind of a problem, you get those two images clearly in mind. Try to think, just position the hands at 3:20, you're told, position the hands at 7:25, and then tell me which angle is greater. Is the angle between the hands at 3:20 greater or less than the angle of between the hands at 7:25? And when you look at it, it's very obvious what the correct answer is. But it turns out that the tighter the angle, the smaller the difference between the angles, the longer it takes for people to be able to give a proper reaction. That is, when you score only reaction times where they get the correct answer, it takes longer to generate that correct answer when the difference between the hands is a relatively narrow angle than when it's a very wide one. Here, for instance, consider the difference in looking at that as the comparison. I mean, that's the maximum non-angle that we can have in terms of clocks, and certainly judging whether the angle is greater at 6 o'clock or 3:20, it's very obvious that 3:20 has the smaller angle. That's no problem. But in essence, what they've been able to demonstrate with those kind of studies using the clocks is essentially that, as we would predict, if you were just kind of thinking about mentally moving your hand between two angles and figuring out which travels further, it does take longer when the difference between the angles is, and I'm going to misspeak here because I'm going two different directions. The point is that when the difference between the angles is small, it takes longer to make the correct judgment than it would if you were trying to imagine the difference in the angles between 3:20 and 6. That's a snap judgment. You can just think about that, know immediately that the angles are maximally different when you're at 6 p.m. Almost as bad at 11:30 a.m. or something like that, or 6 p.m. or 6 a.m. I should say. But in any case, what that does, that argues in favor of the fact that we can read visual images and that we are literally doing so. You may remember Roger Shepard's work some years ago where he took three-dimensional cubes and would give you a given angle of them, and then he would rotate it slightly left or right, that is clockwise or counterclockwise, into the screen or out of the screen, and then give you a second image. And your task was, can you take this one on the one side and rotate it either way so that it will match the one on the other side? And what he found was that the further you had to rotate it in order to get it to match, when it was a match, the longer the reaction time was. Again, suggesting imagery-based work that's going on here. This, in turn, led to a significant amount of work by Neisser and Kerr in 1979. Oh, I forgot I had a nice fancy set of visuals for you. One of the other things they looked at here was how good is the imagery value of the people who were trying to make the judgments of distance or difference between the angles. And what they found was there are tests that will allow us to assess how good you are at creating images in your head. And so what he found was that the reaction time for people who had very poor imagery skills, limited ability to generate images, their reaction times in trying to judge differences between angles tended to be much higher than for those that had a very high imagery value skill. Again, suggesting the existence of something in the brain of those that are high in imagery skill. And what you also find is that as the difference between the angles grows, the reaction time drops. As I said, when there's a very small difference, when you have to make a very tight mental comparison, it takes you longer to make that kind of judgment because the difference between the two angles is so much smaller. This would argue very powerfully in favor of image-based storage, whether or not there's verbal storage. But in essence, what you could argue is that if it were all done verbally, there is no systematic reason to expect that it would be harder to translate from 7:25 to 6:30 as opposed to 7:25 to 6 a.m., where there would be one would be a small, one would be a larger difference in the angle. If it were strictly verbal, we would expect no difference in reaction time, or much less difference in reaction time. But we're finding here a very nice relationship between how much imagery helps, first of all, and secondly, the fact that the broader the distance in the angle, the quicker the judgment is. Both of those are arguing very strongly in favor of image-based memory. And then we look at another fascinating study done by Neisser and Kerr, and here's where stuff is going to begin to get a little bit out of order. It'll be jumbled for a while, but we'll finish strong with everything coordinated at the end. I spent a lot of time working on demonstrations at the end of this sucker, not enough time organizing it at the beginning. But in any case, Neisser in the 1970s and 80s did a very interesting series of studies. The basic image that we're working with here is an upright piano. You're going to have to roll with me a little bit on this. I couldn't find a big enough high-quality image of an upright piano on the internet when I needed it, so I'm using a grand, a concert grand, as a matter of fact. But you'll have to roll with me and pretend like you can't see anything behind it. So that if your memory is like a visual perception, you should not be able to see or remember an image of a bike that is behind that piano. Okay? And so, in essence, what he's going to do is to feed different kinds of sentences to people. And even if you watched a movie of the bike being stored behind an upright, a solid piano, you should not, if in fact memory is visually based, you shouldn't be able to remember it if you've imaged it as being behind the piano. It's a bit of a stressed argument, I will acknowledge, and the critiques are going to come back on that focus a little bit later. But if you're given a sentence such as, a sentence is parked behind an upright piano, and encouraged to visualize it, that is, to think about what you're seeing on the screen here. The point then is that basically you're later given a cue such as bicycle as a reminder of the sentence that I just gave you. And you'll remember that was, a bicycle is parked behind an upright piano. What is going to be argued here, and what they're testing is, does giving you a cue like piano aid at all in recalling the nature of the sentence? Is that any better since the piano is up front? Remember, what we've imaged here is there is a bicycle there, okay? But it's behind the piano. And so the question is, if we give you bicycle as the cue, which in strict image-based memory is hidden, is that going to take you longer to process through, okay, piano is in front of bike, but there is a bike, and so forth? Is that going to take longer to process than if I simply give you, recall me the piano sentence? Because the piano in the initial image is right there. And it turned out that what they found was that they were equally able to recall the sentence, whether bicycle was the cue or piano was the cue, when that was buried among other sentences. I mean, it's not as easy as what I'm describing here, but that's just one exemplar sentence of the kind of thing that they illustrated here. And in essence, that if even compared to recall percentages, when the initial sentence was one as bizarre as a bicycle is parked on top of a stand-up piano, makes no difference. Whether we give you the bike or the piano as a cue, and they're both visible in the image that we've asked you to create, it makes no difference in your speed and accuracy of recalling the sentence, whether they're one behind the other or one on top of the other, which then is a kind of a difficulty. It raises difficulty for image-based models of memory. But you see a problem here. The biggest problem that I see in looking at that, and that other investigators have obviously tumbled to, is what guarantee do we have that the subject, the person we're studying, is using only visual imagery, or for that matter, only one view? I mean, you might, for instance, imagine yourself, if you're creative and good on three-dimensional stuff, angling around behind so that you're looking at the piano from, say, a three-quarter to the rear view. Instead of looking straight at the keyboard, you're down around on either side. You might be looking at the bike's behind the piano, but in fact you've positioned in your head in such a way that you can actually see what's going on there. It might be interesting to try subjects with lower levels of Piagetian sophistication, object permanence, on such tests also. That's another kind of direction that you might go with this, but the problem with this early test is that it didn't seem to be a really fair and irrefutable test. So Keenan and Moore later did another study. Same kind of principles, sentences were involved in this, but in this case what they did was to use much stronger instructions regarding the lack of visibility of the hidden object. That is, they semantically stressed the fact that the piano is hidden. It's a solid, large, stand-up piano. It's a child's bike, and it is fully hidden by the piano so that you cannot see it. And what they found in that case was differential recall favoring the visual object. That is, in that case, if they had stressed, it's hidden, it's behind, you can't see it, then what they found was that given piano as the cue, they could recall a sentence more rapidly than if they gave piano as the cue. That would suggest that the memory that subjects are using is, in fact, a visual perception. Kerr did another very interesting approach. What he did was to use congenitally blind subjects, people who had never been able to see. Those with no vision should not benefit from any kind of visual imagery. They have not had a way to conceptualize it. They don't know what that experience is like. Imagine objects, when those subjects imagine objects that are spatially close. Think about, on campus here, a male-female walking down the sidewalk, If they're good friends, they're likely to be standing close. They'll touch occasionally. If they're boyfriend-girlfriend, they're even going to be holding hands. But those are two people who are very close to each other, okay, emotionally, but I'm talking physically here. And then imagine those same people on the opposite sides of a classroom. Maybe even, to keep it clean, an empty, otherwise empty classroom. Front row, one is sitting on the far left, one is sitting on the far right. And in that case, what we find is that if you imagine objects that are spatially separated, recall is actually worse. That is, again, what we're arguing here is that somehow whatever is used as the retention vehicle does allow for a differentiation of the fact that when you have imaged or thought about two subjects that are physically close to each other, cueing the one leads to more rapid recall of the other than if you're imaging two subjects that are some distance apart, even if we're using imagery in the situation that's described, as I did, big lecture hall, left and right extreme front row seats. Sighted and blind performed equally in that particular task. This would argue against separate visual perception like memory. That is, congenitally blind subjects perform just as well as those of us who are blessed with sight. There's a problem here for the critics, and now what I'm going to do is try and jump ahead and find where my reading is. We've got conflicting images, that I've already talked about. This is where I didn't get a chance to edit a little bit here. But that was the sentence that was used in the nicer study. The effects of stronger image-based instructions was to boost the difference in recall in that situation. Then we've had the study of the congenitally blind, which we've looked at. And the critics' problems is what I'm essentially reviewing here. That is, how do we account for the better effects of recalling concrete words? I come back now to the ease of imagery of creating a mental picture of a concrete word as opposed to an abstract word. One of the ways to get out of that box is to propose, as some psychologists have, what is called a propositional code. Well, here's something I didn't edit out as I should have. Propositional code, okay? That is essentially an abstract representation of both verbal and pictorial materials. This is a bit of a cop-out if you think about it, because what they're really doing here is proposing this higher level. Occam would not be pleased with this, but they're essentially proposing a higher level propositional code, which, and you can see where they're headed, could either be interpreted visually or it could be interpreted in terms of words. Okay? And so this is a proposal. That is, we argue that all incoming information is basically encoded in propositional code, so that to experience an image, the underlying propositional code is the source from which to generate the experience. Okay? Now I'm using a couple of words there, and I want to show you the tie that I'm making there. I'm going back to talk about the fact that the sensory image that initially hits our eyes when we're looking at something visually is the experience. Okay? That is what is ultimately stored in short-term memory with greater or lesser accuracy. But the experience per se is the actual incoming stimuli. And this is what they're arguing here, what is argued by those who endorse the idea of a propositional code. That code is the source from which you can generate meaning, an image, or the actual experience that you're going to use to recall whatever information you're asked to recall. The question then is, can this account for different recall rates for concrete versus abstract words? It's asserted that abstract sentences are more complex in trying to explain the difference there, and we differentiate recall because of the differential recall, I should say, is attributed to the greater difficulty with encoding abstract as opposed to concrete sentences. But basically, for all of that, the argument still remains. How do we theoretically explain the difference in ease of recall of a concrete as opposed to an abstract word? That having been said, what I now want to do is to give you a test. In the book, I'm going to show some material here to you, and I think this is the point at which it's going to show up. We'll see here in a minute. What I'm going to ask you to do is to simply repeat the words. You can do it out loud if you're more comfortable doing that. You can do it to yourself if you'd rather. But I'm going to show you about a dozen word pairs, okay, pairs of words, and I'm going to ask you to just rehearse them to yourself And then what I'm going to do is paired associate task, although I'm going to show you everything at once, which is unusual. But I'm going to show you all of the word pairs, and I'd like you to just recite them. We'll give you a minute in which to do it. And I want you to recite the pairs, and then what I'm going to do is present only the stimulus term and ask you to recall the response. So I'll give you a scrambled list of each of the cues, and I'll ask you to fill in as many of the responses as you can for each of the stimulus terms in the pairs you're looking at. Are you with me? Okay. You have 1 minute in which to look at and study. We'll get to it. These words. Okay, that's about a minute. Now, see how many of them you can recall. Okay, that's about a minute. You've probably done most of them that you're going to be able to. Now, I want to not show that. Put that off the screen for just a second, please. I'll go back. That'll do it. What I'm going to do now is to give you another list of words. And I want you, in this case, to rehearse them, but do it using imagery. That is, each of the words that is involved is concrete, not abstract. And what I'd like you to do in each word pair is to think of an image that somehow links both of them, so that you're going to draw in and actively utilize imagery in this particular situation. Okay? So again, I'll give you about a minute. I had some problem with the timing a minute ago because I have a clock to my left which has a sweep second hand on it which is moving forward, and I have a digital clock on my right which is collapsing. So I gave you roughly a minute. This time I'll concentrate on one clock and you will get exactly a minute. So here we go. Use images as richly as you can to link these pairs of words. Okay. Now, if you will, try to recall as many of those as you can. I'm sorry? Don't tell me. Told you it was a bad day. Okay, I'm not going to be able to conclude that. Well, that was particularly massively poorly done, wasn't it? Yep. Yep, you're right. Totally screwed up. See, that's the problem when we rush. What I was going to prove, and you can repeat this using the demonstration which is in our textbook, is that typically what happens, and I stack this against being able to demonstrate this effect, but in essence what happens is that with imagery, the recall that you get is typically better. And I apologize for not having the right cue words there. Life is not full and rich sometimes. But in any case, what's being demonstrated in this kind of a demonstration is that taking the time to form those images is, in fact, a very significant aid to recall efforts to recall information. And so, well, let's plunge ahead here and see what's next. We'll see what we're going to talk about now. What I'm going to look at is the kind of thing that you were using here to a certain extent, not able to test, but imagery-based mnemonics. And basically, one of the ways to do that is, and before I say that, let me go back and remind you of a piece of data that we showed you a couple of tapes back. You will remember that I showed you paired associate learning where you had two high imagery words, high stimulus, high imagery value response, and the recall was best in that situation. Second best was where we had high imagery value stimulus terms and low imagery value responses. But those two, sharing high imagery value stimulus terms, were the two best learning conditions when it came time to recall the information later. You remember that curve? Keep that in mind when we look at each of the mnemonics that we're about to, because I'm going to show you several different ways in which you can learn pieces of information or lists, grocery lists, for instance. One of the ways to do it is to use what is called the keyword method. Here, the keywords are recited in the following way. Okay? The keyword method is 1 is bun, 2 is shoe, 3 is tree, 4 is what? Spoon. Door. 5 is hive, yes. So maybe you have seen this before, and if not, it is so obvious what's going on that it isn't hard to create your own list. But 6 is sticks, 7 is heaven, 8 is gate, 9 is line, and 10 is hen, or pen. You could use either one. Okay? The value of that list is that if you're driving down 59 in rush hour traffic headed home, and mom calls you on the cell phone and says, "Dear, I'd like you to pick up milk, bread, eggs, and 3 other items." She gives you 6 items at the grocery store that she wants you to pick up before you get home. But, Mom, I can't right now. I'm driving. There's the answer. What you do, the easy one there is 1 is bun. You just make 1 is bread. B in bun, B in bread is one way to do it, but what you're forming is an imagery-rich link between bun and one of the things that you have to remember. Well, it happens bread is an easy one in that case. Shoe, maybe you envision a shoe full of milk or something like that with the water spewing out the shoelace holes and so forth. But in essence, the beauty of this is twofold. First of all, each of the stimulus terms that is there, because what you're essentially doing is 2-level linkage here. 1 is bun, 2 is shoe, 3 is tree. That means you can go directly to 8 and recall gate, because they rhyme and they're so obviously linked by rhyming that it isn't typically difficult to recall any particular item that you need to if order of occurrence is particularly important. But the other thing is that each of the images that is there is one that encourages the forming of linkages between them and whatever it is that you have to recall. So what you do is to put your effort into simply forming a really bizarre link between the pre-memorized words that you've already got there and then the items that you're trying to remember. That's one. What you have here is an imagery-rich, pre-memorized set of stimuli, very similar to the HH and HL lists in that data that I shared with you the other day. All you have to do then is to memorize the response term. And the beauty of it is that you can recall any item in any order if it becomes necessary to do so. Grocery stores aren't necessarily laid out in the order of bread, milk, butter, eggs, and so forth. And so you can go down through the list and recall each item in any order that you may happen to need to. Now, there's a second way to do it, and that is to use instead what is called the method of loci. The method of loci is one that would be unique for each of you. What's involved here is, and the story may be apocryphal, but it was developed by a Roman orator who was speaking to colleagues at the Senate in Rome at a time when the building collapsed. That is, literally the building fell around them. Nowadays we have a tornado, and yeah, it's some shingles and 2x4s. They're not light, but it's potentially survivable. Back then the roof was marble, and so it was great big slabs of everything that collapsed. And apparently what happened, and the story, as I said, may be apocryphal, but the senator who was at the head of the table meeting with 8 or 10 colleagues was the only one that survived. He got through it. The other 10 were squished. They were about that high afterwards. They were 6-footers when they started, but after the roof fell, they were about a half an inch high. They couldn't be identified. And so basically what the authorities did in that case was to invite the senator to come back and give them as much help as possible in identifying who was sitting where. And it is reported, and the basis for this technique is that what he did was to walk to the head of the table. He literally stood where he had been standing when the roof collapsed, and then took a mental walk down the table and back up the other side. Senator Aurelius was sitting here, his assistant was there, and he could just go down and by position, where they had been, name them. That came to be known and has been converted into the method of loci or location. Let me show you a specific example of how that can be done. The trick basically is to imagine a journey that you take easily and can do in your head. Okay? I put a photographic essay together today of one to illustrate not the one I normally use, but one that was available to me where I was writing the notes. Okay? If you're sitting in my office, there's a computer screen directly in front of you. So if I were going to imagine getting up out of that chair, walking out to the parking lot out the back of the building, I'm going to see the following sequence of events, or stimuli, if you want to think about it, and I can image them. I can probably call them from memory without even looking at the list, but you'll see what happens. I have the screen right in front of me, so I can imagine something falling out of the television screen as item number 1. Location number 2 is the printer just to my right when I get up. I turn that way normally when I go out of my chair, so I'm going to see the printer second. I may imagine something gushing out of the printer as a possibility, or maybe the printer is squishing something. There's another possible candidate back there, the telephone, but I'm not going to use it in this particular journey because I want to get all the way outside. The third thing that I pass is the wastebasket. You can see the printer just, it's actually to the left, so you can't see it at the moment. There's a wastebasket just beside me when I'm working. Third image. The fourth one is this object that you see here, but to get out of here I have to walk around to the right, and then I'm looking at a shelving unit. Okay? So that's item number 4 in my imagery-rich, location-based journey. As I walk around the corner to the right there, I come upon the chair that's at the big desk where I sit when I'm not doing computer stuff. So I've got a leather swivel as a 5th possibility. Just behind that, almost out the office, is 2 different choices. This is a round table. If it was not cluttered with stuff right now, that might be a good one, but I've got so much memory stuff stacked on there that may not be such a good one. But otherwise, we could use the file drawers or this shelf as I'm headed out the door. So your pick. I ended up choosing the round table, I think, or maybe the filing cabinet. We'll see in a minute. Out in the hallway, I've got 2 immediate candidates. One is the drinking fountain as I'm headed down the hallway, or if you'll notice, there's a copying machine back over here, so we could potentially use that instead. In this case, I'm going to take the drinking fountain, I believe. As I'm about to round the corner, there's an elevator. That's another imagery-rich possibility. And as I swing the corner, there are the recycling cans. Now, as I'm headed out the door, you'll see that we come immediately to two very obvious candidates, the railing, which is very visually graphic, or that waste disposal mechanism further back. Okay? Probably would take the hand railing here, because if you remember, we were using a wastebasket earlier on, and that might cause confusion. So in essence, if we just list this entire list, what we've got for our method of loci, for me, is this particular journey. Computer screen, printer, wastebasket, filing cabinet, leather chair, round table, drinking fountain, elevator, recycle bins, and hand railing. Each of those is imagery rich. That is, you can remember a picture of what that looks like. That's the imagery rich stimulus term. Again, a common element with mnemonics. The rhyming words and the imagery rich method of location works. I can also do it from my bed. Bedside table, swivel chair, dresser drawer, cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and then walk to the kitchen. You could do a mental journey in going from your bed to your refrigerator or the closest refrigerator. Anything like that would work, but it'll be unique to you, but it's something that you can rehearse and picture each of the items in the order in which they occur. You get the same kind of learning benefits as you do out of the high imagery value rhyming words. And so we're looking there at imagery-based mnemonics. And then let's look at another issue here regarding the recovery of memory, or a related issue in terms of efficiency of memory, which may be that some of these memories are actually false. That is, that we have not actually recalled something that is particularly that's correct. And there are a variety of ways of looking at this. One of the things that we're dealing with here is a concept related to recovered false memories having to do with repression. We go all the way back to Sigmund Freud to thank him for repression. If you remember your basic personality theory, Freud has the components id, ego, and superego. The superego is your conscience, but he also has the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious, which is the triplet that I was trying to reach for a minute ago. Unconscious urges are suppressed. That is, if there are things about you that you ought not to know, according to your own unconscious, it is simply repressed, according to that theory. And it is from that we get some theoretical explanation for how it is that kids, for instance, who have been abused often cannot remember the abuse. They grow past it. Freud would argue that it has been repressed in some way. It might be actively suppressed in some other way. But in any case, it isn't there. And the issue then is, what happens? That is, based on the Freudian concept of repression, what we're essentially arguing is that anything that is sexually or aggressively threatening to us or too pleasureful is simply suppressed from active recall. We can't reach it, despite trying. A therapeutic technique that has been developed involves the therapist essentially assisting or encouraging recall. And that leads into a highly convoluted, very argumentative set of literature. If you want to do some reading on this, look up the name Beth Loftus, L-O-F-T-U-S. She has, as an eyewitness testimony expert, been right at the heart of the argument against therapists who take a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, and end up pulling out of that individual a story about how Dad abused her when she was 2 or 3. There's enough difficulty even generating evidence that we can actually recall events that occur at age 2 or 3, let alone the accuracy with which some of those kids testify about recalled memories. But there's the issue. The issue is essentially, is it essentially implanted in some way, or is it, I hope the next one is going to be there. No, I'm going to have to go to a different order here, so give me a minute. The issue is, in the therapy, was that information actually implanted by the therapist and then recalled, remembered later as an active thought, an active event in which I participated, or not? And that's the issue, and we're going to look at a variety of sources of evidence before coming back to answer that particular question there. But the sub-issue that is involved here is essentially, is memory permanent? We showed you the work from the recall at Ohio Wesleyan of high school images some 50 years later. That argues that the memory is permanent. The demonstration of Gordon Bowers that I showed you, where we gave you the recall cues and you were like 18 out of 20, 20 out of 20 in recalling those, again suggests the memory is there. But there's some related evidence that argues against that, generated by Beth Loftus, related to trying to answer that sub-issue question here, and that is memory actually permanent? You may remember this study, but it is a fascinating one. In essence, it was an eyewitness testimony study based on her filming of an accident on campus. That is, they took two old cars and literally staged an accident right on campus. It was at a popular corner where people were likely to be, or would be familiar with at least. There was a car that was on a cross street. There was another car on a main street that was coming up, and the side street car did have a stop sign at the corner, and the whole thing was photographed from such an angle that you could see all of the pertinent facts. The one street that was a through street and the side street that came in with the sign there. What you actually watched was a relatively minor fender bender. Okay, so one car is coming along the street, the second one either does or does not stop. That becomes a recall item later. But in any case, they run into each other. The one crunches into the side of the one that was on the main street. And in essence, what she does then, and there are all sorts of things you can do playing off that particular study. She has in some cases demonstrated that she can implant false memories. Did you see the green car hit the car that had right-of-way? Or did you see the green car roll through the yield sign? Implanting false memories. So there's a lot that can be done with that. But the basic scene was one car, a second one going through and hitting it at a T intersection. The one that I want to look at specifically here today is a question that she asked, and typically what in this research she did was to show the movie, which runs about 30 or 40 seconds, and then talk to them for about 5 or 10 minutes. So there is a retention interval and some time to lose the fine details of whatever it is that you've looked at. And then you're given a written essay, not essay, excuse me, a multiple choice test. That's one of the clever aspects of this, because I can be asked a different question about the accident than you are. We can all be asked the same questions in different orders, and we can compare accuracy in that way. The particular one that I want to look at is one where you got one of 5 different versions of that particular test, and that was the question in the questionnaire: how fast were the cars going when they verbed? And the verb differed from questionnaire to questionnaire. So in one instance, you had a verb like smashed. How fast were the cars going when they smashed? And the speed estimate in that case was a little bit more, it was almost 41 miles an hour. Pretty healthy accident. The image that was reported afterwards of subjects, when that was the verb, is this kind. That is, it was a pretty major accident that was being imaged in that situation, and yes, if that's what you're remembering, then the likelihood is that the speed estimate is pretty high. But look what happens as the verbs become more neutral. What is that? That's a direct object, I guess. Whatever. Speed estimates are dropping, and at the other extreme, how fast were the cars going when they contacted? The image there is a much gentler one. And in fact, the effect on recall, depending on which generates which, is essentially to alter the speed estimate by about 25%. The average in the high-speed verbs, the violent verbs, was 40 to 42 miles an hour. The average speed estimate when it was a neutral verb like contact was 30 to 32 miles an hour. You think about that a minute. That is an argument. That is a set of data that should cause lawyers a great deal of difficulty, and it does. Because what it's saying is that eyewitness testimony cannot be taken at face value. The different types of words that were used can impact memory. I'm going to show you here in a minute some data that indicates even the act of recalling information can alter what you retain, what you put away again, what you remember. Okay? But the data you've just seen is the basis for a very heated argument between psychologists studying memory, long-term memory, and lawyers. because it goes right to the heart of the viability, the veracity of long-term memory. And here is data that suggests that if you were the car that created the crime there, you want to get a hotshot lawyer who's going to be asking questions of the witnesses that involve smashed into, crammed, mangled, and so forth, because you want to draw out, you want to create a mental image of a violent accident. On the other hand, if you're the defense trying to protect somebody, when the cars bumped, when they made contact with each other, when they kissed each other, that would be a little far, but, and so forth. A week later, these subjects were brought back into the lab to ask another series of questions. And if we go back to the screen for a second, I'll show you that data. They were asked, a week later, did you see any broken glass? And what they found was more evidence damning of eyewitness testimony. And that is, in the situation where the verb was smashed, one of the most violent verbs they had in the questionnaire, the answer ratio was this way. Excuse me. About 1/3 of the subjects reported seeing broken glass. In the actual accident, what was there was cracked glass. That is, one of the headlights from the various photography that was done had obviously cracked and was cracked. But there was no actual broken glass. There were no glass shards on the ground. There was none spilled on the hood of the car that ran into the other one. There was no broken glass present. Cracked, yes, not broken. So that image leads to, a week later, the recall of broken glass by a 2-to-1 ratio. When the verb is hit, one of the most neutral, look at what happens to that ratio. Instead of being about 2-to-1, one part remembering broken glass, the ratio is shifted to almost 4-to-1, 6-to-1. They're much less likely, they're less than half as likely to remember broken glass when the verb that they were asked about the accident a week earlier was one that conjures up an image such as this. So that what's being demonstrated there are two different things. First of all, the verb that you use in a questioning can directly impact what you remember. The actual storage of the information can be altered in that kind of a scenario by using a more violent verb. And how that is stored can also impact your recall of that event, your reconstruction of it, a week later in very detrimental ways. Because what we've got there in that data is a whopping false positive. Every single one of those in that line is wrong. That is a witness that has recalled the accident incorrectly. Okay, that's an error. And all of them are examples of false positive errors in that circled area there. That's a problem for lawyers. That's a problem for eyewitness testimony. It feeds back to the issue of false memories being recovered with aid from the fact that if you're in a lockup somewhere and the police are grilling you with very violent verbs, you tend to remember things a lot differently than if you're simply asked a neutral question like, tell me what happened. Tell me what happened is a much more effective way to get at some semblance of the truth than is, what did you feel like when he slugged your mouth and broke out 2 teeth? Which is creating a much more violent image of what may or may not have happened in that situation. And basically then, let me just figure out where I've gotten to here because I've been doing it off notes for a bit. Give me just a second. The prime point to make there is simply that permanent memory has been permanently altered by the use of a violent verb as opposed to a quiet verb in that situation. They've done it in a variety of different ways. That is, there is one study that is classically cited there, but that was actually replicated a number of different times with different accidents, different sets of questions, and so forth. But the controversy has a lot to do with, essentially, is the therapist actually aiding his or her patient in recalling something that did happen or not? or ideas being implanted simply because of the nature of the questioning that is occurring and the recall that is being encouraged in a particular situation here. The difficulty that we have here is that we cannot know what the actual correct answer is when you and I are trying to recall something that may or may not have happened way back in childhood. We have just demonstrated for you with Loftus's work that the very act of recalling something can alter the memory that you store away. And she has a very fancy punchline at the end of her talk where she talks about, some of your favorite events from childhood may not have occurred at all, and they certainly did not occur in the way that you remember them. Because particularly with good things, we tend to embellish on them and build them. We play a more important role and so forth and so on. That is all memory that is being altered by being utilized in that situation. The problem then that we have is that we cannot know the actual correct answer when we're looking at somebody's long-term memory, but we can replicate it. We can recover things that are not thought about in years based on Barrick's work that I cited to you earlier, but we sometimes recall false memories. And the data, the situation by which to remember that can be done and demonstrated in a couple of different ways. The question then is memory permanent? And the answer can be given to you in a couple of ways. I'm ahead of myself here again. The question is, do they aid it or do they implant it? False memories is what I want to deal with here now, and I want to deal with it in the following way. Well, more editing I should have done that I didn't. Let's look at this. Memorize each of these words, 2 seconds each. Now, what I'm going to show you is a list with twice as many words on it, and I'd like you to, in the margin of your notes, just put yes or no on each of these in response to this question. Was this word included in the group of 8 words that you studied? Yes or no, seam. You're going to end up with 16 wire ends on your notes. Yes or no, prick. Repair, sharp, needle, sewing, sew, thread, thimble, patch, eye, quilt, pin, cloth, point, stitch. Ready for the answers? What I'm particularly interested in is, for those of you that took notes, how many of you said needle was in the list that was given? How many of you said thread, which was the #1 item in the list, so I'm getting not too many hands. The point is that needle and several of the other items that are included there relate to what we were talking about in sewing, basically. needle is one of the common mediators to all of the words that you looked at, and it is very often reported in this kind of a questioning situation as a false positive. That is, that you get people to say yes to needle simply because it relates to prick and sharp and sewing and thread and thimble and eye and pin and point. Okay? All of those are words that relate to needle, but needle itself was not actually cited in that situation. And so you end up with a surprisingly high false positive for needle as being part of that situation. And if I could get my note pages apart, I could give you the actual data. If I remember, it was 75%. No, 50%. In later recall, needle was falsely recalled by over 50% of the people in that particular study. Consider, alternatively, another task that you may have done at some point in your past. James Jenkins, did a really fascinating study a number of years ago in which what he did was to photograph somebody making a cup of tea. Now, if you think about making a cup of tea in your kitchen today, think about all the different things that go into that. You have to get a cup. You probably will get a saucer. If you're going to add cream, you're going to have something to hold that. You're going to have to get the carton of milk. You're going to have to pour the milk into that thing, the pitcher. You've got to have the sugar, or is it sweet and low, or whatever. Which milk? Is it going to be half and half, 2%, full milk, skim milk? You've got to get the privet, that little goofy thing you put on the electric burner so the glass pot doesn't burn. You've got the pot that you have to get. You've got the tea that you have to get. Is it going to be instant tea, or are you going to actually brew your own? If you brew your own, you've got to get the holder, the filter mechanism. You have to pour the tea into that thing. You have to cap it, make sure that it's sealed, and then dunk it in the tea. You have to have a timer for how long it's going to be in there steeping. Okay? You then have to look at it by way of quality, so you're judging color in terms of how intense, does it match what my favorite color is when you're making it. You then have to take off the pot. You have to put the cap on the pot eventually after you're done with filtering steeping the tea. You put the top on it. You then have to pour it. If you're really doing a fancy job with your neighbors, you may even want a spoon that's involved. What Jenkins did was to photograph the very simple act of making a cup of tea. That's all. Simply making a cup of tea. He took 36 different pictures of the entire series, from the initial kind of puzzled look and shall I reach for the cabinet, all the way through to the point where somebody was leaning back drinking the cup of tea. He took 36 pictures of that, and then he showed half of them. What he did was pull out representative samples of about half of them in terms of the total sequence. So he presented a description of making a cup of tea using only 18 of the 36 pictures that he had actually taken. Presented those to the subjects one at a time, showing them the 18 things, and then he gave them a true-false test. So he simply went through about 5 seconds a slide, each of the things so they could study it, and then he went into, after talking to them for a minute or two, a recall test, simply a true-false test. The question to be answered in each case was, did you see this slide in the series that I showed you? And what was demonstrated in that case is the idea that 80% false positives in that situation. They had an average rate of 80% for slides that were integral to the process of making the cup of tea. That is, if the dipping of in this case it was because they wanted a lot of detailed shots. They did use I forget what they call that fancy little filter, but they did show the pouring in of the powdered tea and steeping the tea. They didn't show the actual steeping. Okay, it was photographed in the initial series, but they showed pouring it in, and then the next thing you see is pouring the tea. So clearly the actual steeping act has not been in there. That was one of the slides that was put into the 36 true-false, and they had, on average, an 80% false positive rate for slides they had never seen. That's a particularly damning kind of thing because what you're dealing with there is an act that many of us have participated in. As you could probably sit down and write an essay here now on how to go about making a cup of tea, and they're just a whole series of steps that we know automatically. When I was describing some of the elements, there were people in the room here nodding. I mean, you can appreciate what's involved there. We are so sure that we know how to make a cup of tea that when we then see slides afterwards, we really haven't paid that much attention to it, and you get a 80% false positive rate, which comes back in a way to the idea of eyewitness testimony. I don't have the data here, but at the time Loftus was doing her work, there was a priest in Baltimore who was accused of being a robber, of conducting theft, and that he'd been out around the greater metro Baltimore area accused of thievery. And he was arrested and was put on trial. And people came in, homeowners that had seen him or had seen him in the neighborhood, and the different circumstances under which robberies occur, and positively identified him. I saw that man robbing or in the neighborhood where this robbery occurred, and so forth. Three positive eyewitness statements to the effect that this is the man that did it. He was sentenced, and when he was being sent to jail that day, when the trial had finished, which attracted a lot of attention in the Baltimore area because it was such an authority figure who had been accused of of the crime of theft, it attracted a lot of attention. On the day of his trial, when the guilty verdict came in and he was sentenced, the actual thief walked in and confessed. And it turned out it was somebody who looked very similar, same slightly overweight, 60-year-old, receding hairline, blonde, all a major number of characteristics together. And in fact, some of the witnesses afterwards adamantly refused, no, that's not him. This is the one who did it. But the thief himself basically was a man with conscience and said, basically, if I could have gotten away with it, I never would have confessed. But when somebody else is going to go to jail for my crime, particularly an authority figure like a priest, I can't permit that. I did the crime. So he was coming up when he'd gotten away with it, completely away with it. The tragedy of that, and the reason I burden you with all that, is to think of the implications of poor eyewitness testimony. That man was suspended by the church and did not ever go back to that parish. In fact, he ended up resigning the priesthood because he accumulated some $70,000 of legal debts in trying to defend himself. And because it was a personal action, the church wouldn't help him with donations and so forth. So that false eyewitness identification cost him not only his job, but his career. He ended up, it was all done by, my recitation of that is strictly from news stories, and I never saw the follow-up beyond the figures and the fact that it was a story when he resigned from the church and went on, but he was not a priest at any time after that. That whole thing was based on three people who swore on a Bible, literally, that's the man that did it. And they were wrong. They were demonstrably wrong. So in some cases, the kind of thing that we're thinking about here is events where we know too much. We insert information in there in a way that triggers false memories. There's another kind of situation that can also show up, and that is a situation where you don't have a recall and have a thought and recall a thought, but rather even making tea, the error can occur there. But let's also deal with implanted memories. This was done in a study by Zaragoza and Mitchell in the mid-1960s, 1966. What they did was to show a police film of a burglary, and they followed it with a questionnaire about the event. Questions presupposed the existence of some features that likely would be part of the scene, but were not part of the film which was shown. Okay? Did the young lady wearing the jeans enter through the front or side door? There were no jeans. He was wearing chinos. Okay? Later, asked to write a description of the entire sequence, the participants in that study were very likely to include in the written summary information that had been implanted afterwards, had been either implied by the questions that were asked or actually stated specifically. Loftus, I saw a national news program one time that recorded an incident in Loftus's classroom, where what she did was to stage a robbery. She was lecturing in a hall that had aisles that came down. You can come back to me full screen here for a couple of minutes. She had somebody sitting on the front row with a purse, okay, one of these fold-up desk things, and a purse was sitting right there on the front corner seat. Somebody came in a side door. Now picture it, you've got a lecture hall with Loftus there, big class here. Somebody comes in the side door, walks right up the aisle, picking up, it was a big handled purse, picked up the purse in his arm and just kept walking. Right, I'm sorry, I flipped it. He came down the aisle because the side door was relevant, it was so close. So he came down the aisle with this big handled purse sitting right on the corner, put his arm right through it, never broke pace, just kept right on walking out the door. And the woman is like, oh, wait, that's my purse. By the time that's my purse, he was already gone. I mean, it was only about 2 seconds through the door and gone. And Loftus came in, stepped in, and basically said, did anybody see it? I saw the jeans, I saw the beard. Did anybody see anything else? And she spent about 30 minutes with the class reviewing the entire experiment. Simply walking down, not experiment, what was posed as an actual robbery, theft. And then, after everybody had developed a pretty good description of what was involved with the jeans, the beard, and everything, she brought in 5 people who had various descriptions or various ways they related to the description that the class had actually offered. There was some similarity to the person that actually committed the crime. And the person who was nailed, who was identified by the class as the one who perpetrated the crime, was wearing jeans and had a beard, both of which were clues that were simply implanted by Loftus at the time after the robbery had already occurred, after the guy was already gone. She had added that. They picked out a guy with a beard and jeans, and the greatest similarity to the other things that were described. The actual committer of the crime was not in the 5. The class did not believe it, was very annoyed, and eventually the actual criminal was brought in, the stage criminal. But he was actually brought in, and, you could see from the inhale of air in the class that people were just disbelieving that they themselves could do that kind of thing. But it is very important to keep in mind that how you test somebody in terms of their memory of something is critically determined. What they recall is critically determined by how they are actually quizzed. And when you see these, we watch a lot of detective shows and people being grilled in jail, a lot of the technique that is used in there is simply inappropriate, because they're using specific questions when they should allow the person that's involved to recall the information him or herself. Because when you start asking point-blank questions, you get point-blank wrong answers out of that kind of a situation. Now, in essence, if you've heard the misinformation more times, the likelihood that you will recall it later increases in addition. And so we have a number of different things that we can talk about. I'm not yet ready for a summary, so we'll hold off on that a little bit. But basically, we've interviewed what she also did, Loftus, in another study in the late 1970s, 1977, was basically to interview relatives of the person who was going to participate in the study. This is truly a devious study, if you think about it. But what she did was to identify the parents of various people in her class, undergraduates in her class, and she went and talked to them. And what she got from them was a recitation of at least 3 different events that had occurred. And then she tried to focus them on a particular thing, such as going to a mall. In other words, if she gave the parents the focal point of give me some stories about one of your shopping trips or some of your childhood shopping trips. What do you remember about that occurred in that situation? And she would identify 3 stories based on the information that she drew from the parents of what actually happened in the mall when the parents and little Junior went to the mall to shop. 3 stories, 3 events that were confirmed by both parents since they were interviewed separately. So you've got pretty good inter-subject agreement on what actually happened there. And then she created a paragraph, 3 paragraphs of information there, and a 4th involving a time when the youngster was lost in the mall. That is, the story was that the parents were saying that the kid was lost in the mall and there was a trauma involved and the police having to be called and search going on and so forth and so on. And the basic element was that story had not actually occurred at all. And what was found was that basically the information was manufactured. That is, the person in reading the three things that they clearly agreed with and could perhaps even remember, they got sucked into the fact that, oh, gee, and they read the mall story and they're lost, and they write about that. And they fill in details that weren't even, first of all, the event didn't occur, and then they amplify on the events that are in the story that they were reading there. So they were told to write, I don't remember. They were given 4 stories, basically, 3 of which had been confirmed by both parents. And the 4th one was a manufactured one, applied to everybody getting lost in the mall. They were to read each story and then either comment on it, what did they remember about it, or write, I don't remember. So there was a perfect out. They were told essentially, well, they weren't told, but one of the 4 stories, they had the perfect out if they wanted it. It's just, I don't remember. About a significant number of them basically wrote about that. About 25% of them wrote about the event that simply had not occurred in their lives. We summarize this with one more demonstration, and that is one of the key elements here is that memory does seem to be reconstructive. It is a reconstructive process. We store it in bits, and then we reconfirm it as we need it. For instance, what I want you to do is to imagine the door of the house that you lived in 3 houses back. Think about that a minute. Where you now are, not your dorm room or whichever your front door is at home where you're living. Think about the front door of the place that you lived in 3 houses back. Got that in mind? Tell me the following information, and you'll want to look at the screen to see what I'm proposing here. Was the doorknob in that door on the right, and did that door open in? Or was that doorknob on the left with the door opening in? Or was that doorknob on the right with the door opening out? Or was that doorknob on the left with the door opening out? Where was it? And what is your memory of it? How many of you know the answer? Okay. 60% of the hands roughly are up in the room. The point there is that I'll bet lunch money, supper money, a dinner, you have never been asked that question before. How confident of you, for those of you that had your hand in the air, 1 to 10, how confident are you, just vocalize it, of your response? How many said 8, 9, or 10 among those that were responding? Yeah, everybody's hand goes up. You're quite confident of that. You've never recalled that in your life. Okay? Clear evidence, then, that the information is stored and we simply reconstruct the environment and retrieve from it the information that we need in a given situation. The Deja Vu Experience, something you've seen before can be explained in that way, in an overlap of pieces of evidence that are similar enough to a scene that you actually remember it as if it occurred. And then finally, the tip of the tongue phenomenon. Both of those last 2 can be explained in terms of the idea that our memory is stored in bits and is actively reconstructed. And it's the process of that reconstruction that breaks down when we talk about eyewitness testimony and its reliability. We are done, and we'll start tape 11.